Now that we've seen budget constraints and indifference curves, it's time to try to determine what the optimal consumption for a certain individual will be of a certain good based on that budget constraint. So it's that option which will maximize the utility of the happiness of this individual subject to this budget constraint. So let's try to integrate both of these concepts together onto one graph. So I have my graph. I could have it with different goods. It could still be cola and pizza if I wish. And in this situation here, we had 5 units of pizza, 10 units of cola that could be purchased. And then afterwards, we want to add some indifference curves on this. So if I were to add indifference curves, as was mentioned a second ago, don't make them upward sloping at any point. So I could just have a series of indifference curves, all kind of downward sloping, all kind of this situation here. And they should never cross each other. So even though they look like they might, make sure that they don't cross each other. And along these, I could set up a few points. So here I could have maybe point A over here, point B over here, point C over here. And then I could add other points to kind of illustrate different examples. Point D, point E, and so on and so forth. Okay, so here, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what's gonna be the optimal consumption bundle to consume to make us as happy as possible. Well, in this situation here, if I think of my optimal consumption bundle, I could ask myself, well, do I like to have A, E, B, D, whatever, C? Which of these points do I prefer? Okay. Well, A is in a situation that I'm not using all of my budget. Therefore, it is very unlikely going to be a situation where I will be maximizing my welfare. B, on the other hand, is in a situation that I am beyond my budget constraint. Therefore, this is over my budget. And in this situation, I cannot achieve this consumption bundle, even though I may wish to have it. For the current budget, I just can't get there. And then when I think about these points here, well, D would be the same thing. I can't achieve it. It's beyond. Well, if I compare E and C, which of the two makes me happier? Well, if you recall, the direction of preference of these budget constraints is anything up to the right. So I'm happier on this indifference curve than this indifference curve. I'm happier on this indifference curve than this one, and so on and so forth. Why? Well, because if I think of point C versus point B, well, between point C and B, at point B I have more cola and more pizza, so I must be happier because more of any of the two goods that I like makes me happier. So if I compare point E and point C, even though they're both on the budget constraint, C is superior because it is on an indifference curve that is further out from the origin than E. To prove this, we could also say, well, if I add another point here, call it F, from the theories of indifference curves, we know that this point F is indifference between this point E because I'm on the same happiness or indifference curve line, and therefore I'm indifferent between these 2 points. And if I want to compare F and C, well, naturally I must be happier with C than with F because I could have more cola and more pizza than the other option. Therefore, if I am happier with C than F because I have more of both, I must also be happier with C than E. And this is also seen because I've drawn out these indifference curves. There's an example in the textbook, one of the homeworks that you guys should do, that actually doesn't draw out the indifference curves for you, but it actually sets it up in a certain way that you determine what are you indifferent between and what would be your optimal consumption bundle. Clue here to knowing what is your optimal consumption bundle, it's going to be the situation where I have tangency between indifference curve and budget constraint. What I mean by tangency here is that they're both barely touching. I have this little point that they touch and then they move apart again. Compared to this indifference curve here, it crosses at this point here and it crosses at this point here. So it's not just touching, it actually crosses. Here I'm not crossing at all, here I cross once. But over here I'm not crossing, I'm away from it on one side, I barely touch it, and then I move away again. That's a point of tangency. And if we want to get technical here, if I were to calculate the slope, if I were to able to zoom in on this little area here and I were to calculate the slope, how steep this budget constraint is here and how steep this indifference curve is at this specific point, we would know that we would have an equal slope, meaning that the relative cost of both goods is equal to the relative value that we have of both goods in terms of marginal rates of substitution. That's getting a little bit more technical, but that's just what it means. Whereas over here we can see this is much steeper than this. So it's only when we hit that point of tangency where the slopes are equal and that it's touching that we have our optimal consumption. So over here the slopes may be equal, this one and this one, they're not touching, therefore it cannot be a feasible point. Okay, so this is our optimal consumption point. So every time you draw it, make sure that it's that point that touches. Here, if I look at my indifference curves, they're all downward sloping. The only one here that kind of flattens out, I wouldn't want it to keep going back up, is this one here. So always make sure that they're going downwards as much as possible as you draw these out. Otherwise, you're going against one of the fundamental concepts of indifference curves. This, what I wanted to highlight here, I'm not going to draw a whole other one out here, but what I wanted to highlight was this idea that this indifference curve here is specific to a certain individual. I could have the same budget constraint for someone else with 10 colas, 5 pizzas, but his indifference curves make him consume more of one or the other good. Maybe someone else's indifference curves actually look something like this. Okay, this is a little extreme, but something like this. So that in the end, they are in a situation where they consume a whole lot more cola and much less pizza than the other person. So once again, these indifference curves here are still representing downward sloping, bowing towards the origin. The more to the right you are, upwards right, the happier you are, and so on and so forth. But the shape is very dependent on who you are. So certain people in this classroom, given the same gift certificate to the Lion on a Wednesday night, might consume more beer. Some people might buy more chicken wings. This is all relative on what makes you happier for a given budget constraint.